Veteran freezes after spotting Black Waitress's tattoo. He recognized his lost platoon. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. In a quiet, unassuming diner in the heart of town, a veteran, his face weathered by years of life and war, sat alone at the counter. The soft clink of silverware against plates and the hum of quiet conversation filled the air, but to the old man, it was as if time had slowed down. He watched the waitress behind the counter, her movements efficient but graceful as she served a group of young men in military uniforms. He couldn't help but notice the tattoo on her arm, a black, swirling design that seemed to pulse with meaning. His eyes lingered for a moment longer than was usual. The waitress, unaware of the gaze, continued her work. But to the veteran, the tattoo was not just a design. It was a symbol, a painful memory that pulled him back to another time, another place. A place where he had been surrounded by soldiers, some of whom had never made it out alive. He had seen that symbol before. It was a tattoo given to members of a legendary unit, a unit that had been lost in the chaos of a war long past. His fingers trembled slightly, and he shifted in his seat, a surge of emotions rising within him. The waitress caught his gaze, her eyes curious but unknowing. She smiled, a polite but tired smile, and he smiled back, though his heart was heavy. He had tried to forget that past, but it seemed impossible when faced with such a clear reminder. She glanced down at her own tattoo and then back at him. It was a brief, fleeting moment, but it spoke volumes to the veteran. He stood up slowly, his body creaking with the weight of age and the weight of memories. He walked over to the counter, his footsteps steady but slow. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Where did you get that tattoo?" The waitress looked up, startled. "It's a family thing," she said with a shrug. "Passed down through generations." The veteran's heart skipped a beat. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "It's from the old unit," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The waitress's smile faltered for a moment, and then she said, "My father was in it." The words hit the veteran like a punch to the gut. He took a step back, his mind racing. Could it be? Could she really be one of the lost ones? He studied her face, the shape of her features, the way she carried herself. Then it clicked. This was no coincidence. This young woman, the waitress serving coffee and eggs to strangers, was connected to the very unit he had fought alongside, a unit that had been erased from the history books. The veteran froze, unable to speak, his mind whirling with the memories of that fateful day, the day everything had changed. The waitress noticed his hesitation and gave him a curious look. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked softly. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. His gaze dropped to her tattoo once again, and he saw it. The unmistakable mark of those who had fought and bled together, who had lost their brothers and their lives for a cause that had been forgotten by most. He finally found his voice, his words barely a whisper. "You're one of them, aren't you?" The waitress's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, it seemed as if she was about to speak, but then she stopped herself. Instead, she looked down at her tattoo and nodded slowly. The veteran felt a lump form in his throat. He had always wondered what had happened to the others, to the men who had been with him in those dark, harrowing days. But now, standing before him, was a link to that lost platoon, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what came next. The veteran stood frozen, his mind reeling. He stared at the waitress, her face now etched with something that resembled recognition. The tattoo on her arm, the symbol of a forgotten unit, had brought him back to a place he thought he'd left behind forever. A place filled with comrades, blood, and loss. For a moment, everything around him faded away, the clinking of coffee cups, the quiet hum of the diner, the low murmur of voices. All that remained was the tattoo, the mark of his lost platoon. The waitress seemed to sense the sudden shift in the air, the weight of the moment, and she stood a little straighter, her eyes never leaving his. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly, her voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. The veteran took a deep breath, his chest tight with emotion, before he nodded. "I was there. I fought with them. he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't know what happened to them, do you? She shook her head slowly, her lips pressed together in a thin line. I didn't know much about it. My father, he never talked about it. But he had that tattoo, just like mine. He always said it meant something important. The veteran's heart skipped a beat as memories flooded back. His mind raced, jumping from one memory to the next, flashbacks to the jungles of Vietnam, the camaraderie of his platoon, and the fateful day that had changed everything. He closed his eyes for a moment, the images too vivid to ignore. He could hear the sound of helicopters in the distance, the crack of gunfire, and the choking smoke from explosions that tore through the air. He could see his brothers in arms, the men he had fought beside, falling one by one. The memory of that day still haunted him. He opened his eyes, and for a brief second, he saw the faces of those men again. Faces that had been lost to time. Faces that had been erased from the history of the war. Your father, he was one of them, wasn't he? The veteran's voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of the question heavy on his heart. The waitress nodded, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. He was, she said, her voice soft but steady. He was a part of that unit. A special unit. But no one talks about it anymore. It's like they never existed. The veteran's hand trembled as he reached out, touching the edge of the counter for support. His heart ached with the memory of that loss, the feeling of being left behind, forgotten. He had always wondered what had happened to his platoon, to the men who had fought beside him, who had saved his life more times than he could count. And now, here she was, the daughter of one of those men. They called us the ghosts, the veteran said, his voice filled with sadness and pride. We were the ones they sent in when everything else failed. We were supposed to be invisible, but we weren't. We fought, and we died, and in the end, they erased us from the history books. The waitress seemed to absorb his words, her gaze softening. I never knew any of this, she said quietly. My father never talked about it. He just left it all behind. He couldn't leave it behind, the veteran said, his voice growing more intense. None of us could. We were brothers. And the things we did, the sacrifices we made, they shaped who we were. But no one ever gave us the recognition we deserved. No one ever cared. The veteran paused, swallowing hard. Until now. The waitress looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and something deeper, something that seemed to echo the pain in his voice. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. He stared at her, his eyes searching for the right words, the words that could explain everything. I've spent my whole life wondering if anyone would remember us, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But you're the link. You're the one who can bring us back. You're the one who can make people remember. The waitress's eyes widened in realization, and for a brief moment, she seemed to understand. The weight of the past, the legacy of those who had been lost, had fallen squarely on her shoulders. She looked down at her tattoo, her fingers lightly brushing the design, as if it had suddenly become a part of her she had never fully understood. I don't know if I can do that, she whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. The veteran nodded slowly, understanding the fear in her voice. I don't know either, he said quietly. But together, we can make them remember. We can make them see what they lost. And maybe, just maybe, we can find the peace we've been searching for all these years. I am sorry for everything that has happened to you. But the truth is, none of us were ever forgotten. We were all heroes, and heroes never disappear. I'm calling in a few people, the veteran said, his voice growing firm as he picked up his phone. The waitress, her hand still trembling slightly, watched as he dialed. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fade. The clatter of plates, the murmur of voices, everything vanished. All that remained was the weight of the moment, the weight of what was about to happen. The old man's phone rang once, twice, then someone picked up. General, it's me, the veteran said quietly. I need help. We've got to make sure the story is told. The veteran paused, listening intently. The waitress didn't need to hear the words. She could already sense the urgency in the veteran's voice, the gravity of the request. She had been watching him for the past hour, listening to the way he spoke of the past, of the men who had fought beside him. There was no doubt in her mind that this was a story worth telling. And yet, a part of her still felt unsure. She had always known her father's legacy, but hearing the veteran speak of it with such reverence, such intensity, it made her wonder if she had ever truly understood what her father had gone through. I'm not sure I can do this, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. The veteran turned to her, his eyes softening as he placed the phone down. You're not alone, he said. We're in this together. You don't have to do it alone. It's time we tell the world the truth. She nodded slowly, her resolve beginning to solidify. She was ready now, or at least, she knew she had to be. The veteran had started something, and now it was up to them to finish it. Where do we start? She asked, her voice steady. The veteran gave a small smile, his face wrinkled with age but still holding a certain strength. We start by telling the truth. We tell them who we were, who we are, and we make sure they never forget us again. As he spoke those words, something in the room shifted. It was as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders, as if the very air itself had become lighter. The waitress stood up, her eyes filled with purpose. She was ready. She had to be. The door of the diner swung open, and in walked a group of men in military uniforms. The veteran didn't need to say a word. They were here. The time had come. The general, who had been on the other end of the call, walked in first, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He was tall, his uniform crisp and spotless, and his eyes were filled with the weight of history. The men who followed him were equally as imposing. They were soldiers, veterans, and they knew exactly why they had come. The veteran stood to meet them, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. General, the veteran said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for coming. The general gave a curt nod, his eyes scanning the room before they fell on the waitress. She stood there, her posture straight, her eyes filled with determination. This is her, the veteran said, nodding toward the young woman. She's the key. She's the one who will help us tell the story. The general studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he took a step forward and extended his hand. It's an honor to meet you, he said, his voice deep and measured. The waitress shook his hand, her own grip firm but not without a trace of nervousness. Thank you, she said, her voice steady. I just want to make sure my father's story is told. I don't want his sacrifice to be forgotten. The general gave her a solemn nod, his face softening slightly. It won't be forgotten, he said quietly. We'll make sure of that. As the general and his men took their seats, the veteran looked around the room, his heart swelling with pride. This was the moment he had been waiting for. They were going to do this together. They were going to bring the ghosts of the past back to life, and they were going to make sure the world knew who they were. The waitress stood by the counter, watching as the men began to talk. She couldn't hear the specifics of the conversation, but she could see the urgency in their gestures, the way they leaned in toward each other. She felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was where she belonged. This was the legacy she had been searching for. As the minutes passed, the veteran finally turned to her, his eyes glistening with emotion. It's time, he said simply. Let's tell them the truth. With that, the waitress nodded. The veteran had found the strength to face his past. Now it was her turn to face hers. She stepped forward, standing tall, ready to tell the world the story of the lost platoon. And together, they would ensure that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. I can't believe it's really happening, the waitress whispered as she looked around at the group of veterans gathered at the table. The general and the others had made it clear. They were going to fight for the truth to be known. The waitress, her heart racing, couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by everything that had unfolded over the last few hours. She had gone from being a simple diner waitress to the keeper of a legacy she never even knew existed. Her father's past, the unit he was part of, the men he fought beside, all of it was now her responsibility to tell. But she knew she wasn't alone. She could feel the weight of their support, the veterans who had come together to honor the past. The veteran who had reached out to her had shared his experiences, his pain, his memories. She had seen the raw emotion in his eyes, the deep sorrow that never seemed to fade. But now, standing here with the others, she felt a sense of purpose. She could do this. They could do this. They were going to make sure that no one ever forgot the sacrifices of the platoon, that their story was told, that the men who fought and died would be remembered. She took a deep breath and stood up, her mind focused and clear. The general gave her a nod of approval as he stood alongside her. Tell them what you know, he said. Tell them the story of your father's platoon. Let them know who they were. With the veteran at her side, she began to speak. My father never talked much about his time in the military, she began, her voice steady. He always wore the tattoo, but it was just a part of him. Nothing special, nothing he ever explained. But now I understand. This tattoo means something. It represents more than just a unit. It represents family, sacrifice, and a bond that can never be broken. The general nodded, his expression solemn as he looked at the others at the table. Your father's platoon was something special, he said, his voice low and measured. They didn't ask for recognition. They didn't care about medals or fame. They just did their job, saving lives, fighting for each other, and making sure no one was ever left behind. They were called the Ghosts. But the truth is, they were legends. And they deserve to be remembered as such. The veteran who had reached out to her, the one who had shared his story, spoke up. I was there with them. We fought side by side. I've seen things that no one should ever have to see. But I've also seen bravery, loyalty, and brotherhood like no other. Those men, your father included, were more than just soldiers. They were heroes. And they deserve more than just a forgotten history. They deserve a place in the stories that are told, in the history books that will be passed down through generations. They deserve to be remembered. The waitress swallowed hard, her emotions rising again as she looked at the men around the table. She could see the respect in their eyes, the deep understanding they shared. They weren't just soldiers. They were family. And now, together, they were going to make sure that the Ghosts were never forgotten. The veteran turned to her, his eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've given us the chance to finally honor them. You've given us the chance to make sure their story is told. She smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. No, she replied, her voice steady. It's not just me. It's all of us. Together, we're making sure they're remembered. Together, we're making sure the Ghosts live on. The general gave a small nod, his eyes reflecting the same sense of purpose. We'll start by telling the world. We'll reach out to those who knew them, those who remember them, and we'll make sure their story is shared with everyone who'll listen. The Ghosts will never fade into the shadows again. As they gathered around the table, the veteran took one last look at the waitress, his eyes filled with gratitude. The journey ahead would be long, but it would be worth it. They had a story to tell, a story that needed to be heard, and they were going to make sure that the Ghosts would never be forgotten. The bond between them all had been forged in the fires of war, and now it was being honored. The world was about to hear the truth, and nothing could stop them now. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of purpose. The veteran, the waitress, and the group of men who had once been part of the Ghost platoon were determined to make sure their story would be told. The diner, once a place of casual encounters, had become the epicenter of a movement to honor the forgotten soldiers. They had a plan now, and the steps were clear. They would begin by reaching out to anyone who had known the Ghosts, anyone who could offer a glimpse into the lives of those lost soldiers. The waitress, who had once been a stranger to this world, now felt the weight of the history she had inherited. She had already made calls, contacted old friends of her father's, and reached out to the families of the men who had served in the same unit. It wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about the entire platoon. The veteran, who had been the catalyst for everything, spent hours making connections, going through old records, and revisiting places he hadn't thought about in years. His hands, once steady in battle, now trembled slightly as he touched the papers that held the names of his comrades. But with each name he spoke aloud, he could feel something stirring inside him. This was no longer just about remembering. It was about ensuring that these men were not forgotten again. The general and the other veterans had come together with the same mission, to ensure that the Ghosts, as they had been called, would live on in history. As the days went by, they gathered more and more people who had known the men of the platoon. Some were former soldiers, others were families who had been left behind. There were whispers of their bravery, their loyalty, and their sacrifice, stories that had never made it into the history books. But now, they were coming to the surface. It was a slow process, but they were making progress. The waitress had never seen her father so alive as he had been in these moments. She had always thought of him as just her father, the man who had raised her, but now she was seeing him as part of something bigger. She was learning about the life he had lived before she was born, the sacrifices he had made, and the bond he had shared with those men. And through it all, the veteran was by her side, offering guidance and support. He had become more than just a man from the past. He had become a mentor, a friend, and a living connection to her father's past. Then, one day, they received the call. The records were complete. They had gathered enough stories, enough evidence, to prove that the ghosts were not just a legend. They had been real. They had fought, bled, and died for each other, and now their legacy would be honored. The veteran stood up, his eyes sharp and focused. It was time. The world needed to know. The general and the rest of the group were already preparing for the next step. They would contact the media, get the story out there, and make sure that every corner of the country knew who the ghosts were and what they had done. The waitress, now standing beside the veteran, felt a surge of pride. This was her moment, too. She wasn't just telling her father's story. She was telling the story of all those who had fought beside him. The veterans, the families, the friends, they had all come together to make this happen. The world would finally know. The ghosts would no longer be forgotten. And in that moment, the veteran turned to her with a knowing look. "We did it," he said softly. "We made sure they'll never be forgotten." She smiled, her heart full. "We did," she agreed. And for the first time, the weight of everything they had done together didn't feel heavy. It felt right. It was the night before the meeting with the press, and the atmosphere in the diner was different now. The quiet hum of the usual customers had been replaced by the determined chatter of the veterans, each one poring over documents, sharing memories, and preparing to tell the world what had happened to their lost platoon. The waitress stood behind the counter, observing the scene. She had never imagined that this moment would come. She had always known that her father's past was important, but she had never imagined how much it would change her life, how much it would bring together people she never knew existed. The veteran, who had guided her through this journey, had become more than just a mentor. He had become the bridge to the past, the one who could finally bring their story to light. He sat at a corner table, going through old photographs, his fingers tracing the edges of images that had once been forgotten. The memories in those pictures were more than just faces. They were the faces of men who had fought side by side, men who had sacrificed everything for each other. Now, the time had come to bring their names back into the light. He looked up from the photograph and met the waitress's gaze. She could see the weariness in his eyes, but also the hope. The weight of years of silence was finally being lifted. She walked over to him, her hands steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "We're ready," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. The veteran nodded slowly, his face lined with age and experience. "Yes, we are. Tomorrow, the world will know what happened to us. Tomorrow, we will finally be seen for who we really were." They both knew that tomorrow would be a turning point. It wasn't just about telling their story. It was about giving the ghosts the recognition they had been denied for so long. They were going to show the world that these men had been more than just soldiers. They had been heroes. The press conference was held the following morning in a small conference room, a space filled with reporters and photographers. The veterans, now standing tall and proud, were seated at the front. The waitress stood beside them, a quiet strength radiating from her as she took her place next to the veteran who had guided her. The general, the one who had come to support the cause, stood beside them, his presence commanding attention. The room fell silent as the veteran stood up to speak. His voice, once rough with the years of battle, was now steady, filled with purpose. "For too long, we have been forgotten," he began. "But today we stand, here to make sure the world remembers. We are the ghosts, and this is our story." The words rang out, clear and unwavering. The reporters, once skeptical, now listened intently, their pens moving quickly as they wrote down every word. The waitress felt a shiver run down her spine as she stood beside him. This was it. The moment she had feared and hoped for had finally come. The veteran continued, recounting the history of the platoon, the missions they had undertaken, the sacrifices they had made. He spoke of the men who had given everything, of the bond that had held them together in the face of danger, and of the lives they had saved, even at the cost of their own. As he spoke, the room grew still. The reporters who had once viewed this as just another story were now fully engaged, their expressions filled with awe and respect. The ghosts were no longer just a footnote in history. They were men who had fought with honor, who had given everything for their country, and now, their story was being told. When the veteran finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, one by one, the reporters began to ask questions, eager to learn more. The waitress stood quietly, absorbing the moment. She had never imagined that this story, her father's story, would be shared with the world. And yet, here they were, making sure that the ghosts would never be forgotten again. As the press conference came to a close, the general stood up and addressed the room. "These men, and the woman beside them, have brought us together to honor the ghosts," he said, his voice strong. "They have fought for our freedom, and now, they deserve to be honored. Today, we make sure that their names will live on." The reporters nodded, their respect evident. The waitress felt a sense of pride wash over her as she looked around the room. This was the moment she had been waiting for. This was the moment her father's legacy, and the legacy of all the men who had fought with him, would finally be recognized. They had done it. The ghosts were no longer forgotten. They were heroes, and their story would be told for generations to come. The veteran turned to the waitress, a smile on his face. "We did it," he said quietly. "We made sure they'll never be forgotten." She smiled back, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes," she agreed. "We did." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The veterans, the general, and the waitress had done what they set out to do. They had brought the story of the ghosts to the world. The press coverage had been overwhelming, and soon, their story was everywhere. Newspapers, news broadcasts, online articles. The ghosts were no longer lost in the shadows of history. They had been resurrected. But with that recognition came a new responsibility, one that none of them had expected. The ghost story had touched hearts across the nation, and now people were reaching out, wanting to know more. Families of fallen soldiers, other veterans who had served alongside the ghosts, and even strangers who had been moved by their bravery, all wanted to connect. The waitress, who had once been a quiet observer of her father's past, now found herself at the center of it all. She was no longer just a daughter trying to honor her father's memory. She was part of something bigger, a movement to ensure that the sacrifices of the ghosts would never be forgotten. The veteran, who had started this journey, had become a kind of unofficial spokesperson for the ghosts. He spent hours on the phone, talking to the press, answering questions from the families of the fallen, and sharing stories that had been buried for so long. He was a man who had seen too much, but now, as the world listened to his words, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. As the days went by, the waitress found herself more involved than she had ever anticipated. She had always wanted to know more about her father's past, but now she was learning more than she ever thought possible. The stories she was hearing, the camaraderie, the sacrifices, the loyalty, were nothing like she had imagined. The ghosts were more than just soldiers. They were brothers, bound together by experiences that could never be shared by anyone outside their unit. She spent hours speaking with surviving members of the platoon, hearing their memories, their regrets, and their pride. They were no longer just names on a page or photos in a scrapbook. They were living, breathing men who had given everything for each other. She could see it in their eyes when they spoke about the ghosts. They hadn't just fought for their country. They had fought for each other. And now, it was up to her to ensure that their story was told the way it deserved to be told. But with all the attention came pressure. The pressure to make sure the story was perfect, to make sure every detail was accurate, to make sure the ghosts were remembered in the right light. The general, who had been a rock for the veteran throughout this process, sat down with the waitress one evening, his expression serious. "You've done something remarkable," he said, his voice deep and steady. "But now, we have to be careful. The world is listening. We can't let their story be twisted or forgotten. We owe it to them to get it right." The waitress nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had always known how important this was, but now it felt even more real. This wasn't just about telling a story. It was about making sure the ghosts were remembered as they had been. Heroes who had never asked for recognition, but who deserved it more than anyone. The veteran, who had been quiet lately, spoke up. "We have to do this for them," he said. "For the ones who didn't make it home. For the ones who never got the chance to tell their stories. We have to be their voices." It was a sentiment that resonated with everyone in the room. The waitress could feel the fire in his words, the passion that had driven him to start this journey. And now, she felt it too. This was bigger than just her father's legacy. This was about honoring all of them, the ghosts who had fought and died, the ones who had survived and never been able to tell their stories. She wasn't just telling her father's story anymore. She was telling the story of all the men who had served with him, all the men who had been lost, and all the men who deserved to be remembered. The days that followed were filled with more interviews, more articles, and more meetings. The story of the ghosts began to spread far and wide. People who had never heard of them before were now learning about their courage and sacrifice. And with every new person who learned about the ghosts, a piece of their legacy grew stronger. The waitress knew that they still had a long way to go. There were still many more stories to be told, and there were still many more people who needed to hear them. But for the first time, she felt like she was part of something truly special. She was giving the ghosts the recognition they had earned, and she was making sure they would never be forgotten again. As she looked around at the men who had fought beside her father, she realized that this was only the beginning. The world would know their names, their stories, and their sacrifices. The ghosts would live on, not just in memory, but in the hearts of every person who heard their story. And in that moment, she knew that the legacy of the ghosts would never fade, as long as she was there to tell it. The recognition the ghosts received was overwhelming. The public reaction was nothing short of extraordinary. News outlets, veterans groups, and even schools began reaching out to learn more about the platoon's history, eager to share the stories of the men who had fought so bravely, so quietly, for their country. The waitress, who had once been unsure of her place in all this, now found herself at the center of something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. She had become the bridge between the past and the present, between the ghosts of her father's unit and a world that had long forgotten them. But despite all the attention, something still weighed heavily on her heart. It wasn't just about telling their story anymore. It was about preserving it, making sure that the memories of the ghosts lived on, not just as a fleeting headline, but as a part of history that would be remembered by future generations. The veteran, the man who had sparked this journey, had been by her side every step of the way. But now, as they sat together in the diner late one evening, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He had done so much, given so much, and now the weight of it all seemed to be catching up with him. She placed a hand gently on his arm, offering silent comfort. He looked at her, his eyes tired but grateful. "We did it," he said quietly. "We told the story, and the world is listening. But it's more than that. It's not just about being remembered. It's about making sure the right lessons are learned from our story, that they never forget the sacrifices we made." She nodded, her throat tight. She understood what he meant. She understood that it wasn't enough to just share the ghost's history. It was about ensuring that the world truly understood what they had been through, the cost of freedom, and the price of loyalty. She wasn't sure how they were going to do it, but she knew they had to. They had to make sure that the lessons the ghosts taught through their sacrifices would live on, long after the stories faded from the headlines. And so, they began to plan. The veteran called upon his old comrades again. The general, the soldiers, and the families of the men who had served together began to gather once more, this time to ensure that their history would be preserved in a way that would transcend just articles or news stories. They would write a book, a comprehensive account of the ghosts' missions, their bravery, and their ultimate sacrifice. They would donate it to libraries, schools, and museums, ensuring that future generations would learn about them. The project took months, as they carefully reconstructed the story of the ghosts from the memories of those who had been there. The waitress spent countless hours with the veterans, listening to their tales, organizing their accounts, and compiling everything into a narrative that would stand the test of time. Through it all, she had come to realize that this wasn't just about her father or the ghosts. It was about a collective memory, a shared history that belonged to everyone who had ever served, who had ever sacrificed for their country. And as the book neared completion, they knew that this was something bigger than they could have ever imagined. The waitress and the veteran watched as their work came to life. The book, titled The Ghosts of History, was published, and soon copies were being sent to veterans organizations, schools, and libraries across the country. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were moved by the story, touched by the men who had given so much and been forgotten by the world. It was clear now, this wasn't just about remembering the ghosts. It was about honoring the sacrifices of all those who had ever served, and ensuring that their stories, their legacies, would never fade away. The veteran stood with the waitress at the book launch, surrounded by the men who had fought alongside him. As he looked around at the room full of people, the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. This was more than just a success. It was a victory. The ghosts had been remembered, and their story would live on for generations to come. The waitress smiled as she watched the men who had once been silent now sharing their stories with the world. It had been a long journey, but they had done it. They had made sure that the ghosts would never be forgotten. And in that moment, she knew that her father's legacy, and the legacy of all the men who had served, was secure. They had given their all. And now, they had been given the recognition they deserved. The success of the ghosts of history was more than just a moment of recognition. It became a catalyst for something far greater than any of them had anticipated. The book's release had sparked a movement. People who had never heard of the ghosts before were now learning about their bravery and sacrifice. Veterans from all over the country began reaching out, some to share their own stories, others to express their gratitude for finally seeing the sacrifices of those who had fought so hard, so quietly, for their country. The veteran, now older but with a fire that still burned strong, stood beside the waitress at the book signing event. It had been a long road, and neither of them could have predicted just how powerful this project would become. The media attention had only grown. Major news outlets, talk shows, and even documentaries were now interested in the ghost story. The veteran had become a figurehead for this legacy, speaking at events, sharing his experiences, and honoring the men who had fought beside him. And it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the present. It was about creating a space for the stories of all veterans to be heard, and for the sacrifices of those who had served to be acknowledged. The waitress, who had once felt like an outsider to this world of military history, had become a part of it in ways she never thought possible. Her role in bringing the ghost story to light had changed her. She no longer just remembered her father's past. She had given it new life, and through that, she had given herself a new sense of purpose. It was a purpose that extended far beyond her father. It was about ensuring that no veteran would ever feel forgotten again. One evening, as they sat in the diner after another long day of interviews and events, the veteran turned to her, his expression softening. "You've done more than I could have ever asked for," he said, his voice carrying the weight of all the years that had passed. "You've made sure that the ghosts will never be forgotten. And you've done something even more important. You've made sure that the voices of all veterans are heard." The waitress smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. She had always known the value of her father's sacrifice. But now, sitting across from this man who had seen so much, she understood the depth of that sacrifice in a way she hadn't before. It wasn't just the ghosts who needed to be remembered. It was all the men and women who had served, who had given so much and had never received the recognition they deserved. She turned her gaze to the door of the diner, where the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the world outside. It felt like everything had changed. The journey that had started with a quiet conversation in the corner of a diner had now become a movement. The ghosts were no longer ghosts. They were heroes, and their legacy would live on, not just in the pages of a book, but in the hearts of every person who heard their story. "I didn't do it alone," the waitress said softly, her hand resting on the table. "We did it together. All of us." The veteran nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Yes, we did. And now we keep going. We make sure that every story is told, every voice is heard. It's not just about the past anymore. It's about making sure that the future never forgets the sacrifices that were made." As the diner began to quiet down, the waitress looked around the room. The familiar faces of regular customers were still there, but now, it felt different. It wasn't just a diner anymore. It was a place where stories were shared, where memories were honored, and where heroes were remembered. She had found her purpose, and it was bigger than she could have ever imagined. The veteran stood up, his back straight and his eyes full of purpose. "We've done good work here," he said, looking around at the men and women who had helped him along the way. "But we're not done yet. The world needs to hear more. There are more stories to tell, more heroes to honor." The waitress stood up as well, her heart swelling with pride. She had always thought her journey would be a quiet one, that her role would be small. But now, she understood that sometimes, the smallest voices can create the biggest ripples. Together, they had made sure the ghosts would never be forgotten. And they weren't stopping there. They would make sure the world never forgot the men and women who had served, who had sacrificed, and who had given everything. It wasn't just their legacy anymore. It was the legacy of every veteran, every soldier, and every person who had ever given their all for their country. The waitress took a deep breath, looking around at the room one last time. This was just the beginning. The ghosts were no longer lost, and neither were all the others who had been forgotten. Their stories would live on, forever. And with that, they stepped into the future, together. The success of the ghost story was undeniable, but with that success came a new challenge, a challenge the veteran, the waitress, and their team had not expected. As more and more people learned about the ghosts and their heroic sacrifices, the pressure to honor their legacy properly grew. It wasn't just about sharing their story anymore. It was about ensuring that future generations would not only remember, but also understand the importance of what these men had done. The veteran sat in the same diner booth where it had all begun, looking over a stack of letters that had come from across the country. Letters of thanks, letters from veterans who had served in different wars, and letters from young people who were hearing the story for the first time. All of them were deeply moved, but there was one letter that caught his attention, a letter from a high school teacher in a small town in Texas. The teacher had read the ghosts of history to his students, and now they wanted to do something to honor the platoon. The veteran felt a lump form in his throat as he read the words. This was why they had done it, to make sure that the ghost would live on, not just in history, but in the hearts and minds of future generations. The waitress, who had become more than just an observer in this journey, had been working tirelessly alongside the veteran to keep the momentum going. She had helped coordinate speaking engagements, set up fundraisers for veteran organizations, and even organize school programs to share the story with young people. But now, as the letters and calls continued to pour in, she began to realize just how far their efforts had reached. One afternoon, as she was preparing for another round of interviews, she received a call that would change everything. A major military foundation had reached out, offering to sponsor a nationwide tour to share the story of the ghosts. They wanted to take the message directly to military bases, schools, and communities across the country. The waitress sat in stunned silence as she listened to the details. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for, the chance to make sure the ghost story reached every corner of the nation. She immediately called the veteran, her heart racing with excitement. "We have to do this," she said, her voice full of determination. "This is our chance to make sure they're remembered in every town, every city, every military base in the country." The veteran paused on the other end of the line, a smile creeping onto his face. "I knew this was bigger than we thought," he said, his voice steady. "Let's do it. For the ghosts. For all of them." And just like that, the next chapter of their journey began. The nationwide tour was unlike anything they had imagined. They traveled from state to state, visiting military bases, schools, and veteran organizations, sharing the stories of the ghosts and the lessons they had learned through their sacrifices. Everywhere they went, they were met with standing ovations, tears, and heartfelt gratitude. The veteran, once a man who had carried the weight of his memories alone, now stood in front of crowds, telling the stories of his brothers in arms, making sure that their bravery and loyalty would never fade into the past. The waitress, who had once feared she would never fully understand her father's legacy, now felt a sense of purpose that transcended anything she had imagined. She had become the voice of the ghosts, the one who connected their past with the present and the future. As the tour continued, they began to see the impact they were having. Students in classrooms across the country were reading the story of the ghosts, learning about the sacrifices of those who had served before them. Veterans, both young and old, found healing in the stories, and families who had lost loved ones in wars past found a sense of closure. It was as if the ghosts had become more than just a platoon. They had become a symbol of something greater, the unbreakable bond between soldiers, the sacrifices made for freedom, and the importance of remembering those who gave everything for their country. At the end of the tour, the veterans stood on a stage in front of a crowd of fellow veterans, their families, and supporters. He looked out over the sea of faces, many of them with tears in their eyes, and he realized something. This was the culmination of everything they had worked for. The ghosts were no longer forgotten. They were heroes, and their legacy would live on forever. The waitress stood beside him, her heart swelling with pride. She had never imagined that a simple act of honoring her father's memory would lead to something so much bigger. But now, as she looked at the crowd, she understood. This was why they had done it, to ensure that the ghosts, and all the men and women who had served in silence, would be remembered, not just as soldiers, but as heroes. Thank you, the veteran said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for remembering us. For remembering the ghosts. We fought for each other, and now, together, we've made sure that no one will ever forget what we did. We will live on in the stories we've shared, in the lives we've touched. And for that, I'm forever grateful. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the hall like a roar of approval from all those who had finally come to understand the true meaning of sacrifice. And as the veteran and the waitress stood there, side by side, they knew their work was far from over. They had brought the ghosts back to life, but now, it was up to everyone to make sure their story would never fade away. The success of the tour had been everything they hoped for and more. The veterans, the families, and the general had made sure that the ghost story was shared with as many people as possible, and their message had resonated deeply with everyone they met. But as the last event of the tour came to a close, and the applause faded into the quiet of the night, the waitress and the veteran knew there was still more to do. The world had heard their story, but it wasn't enough just to share it. They needed to ensure that the story would live on for future generations, that the lessons of the ghosts, their sacrifices, their brotherhood, their courage, would never be forgotten. The veteran looked out the window of the small office they were using as a base of operations for the tour, his thoughts distant. His body was tired, worn from the road, but his mind was still sharp. The journey was far from over. We've done good work, he said, his voice steady. But it's not just about this tour. It's about keeping their memory alive every single day. The waitress, now standing beside him, nodded in agreement. She had come so far from the young woman who had once been unsure of her role in this journey. Now, she felt like a keeper of history, a steward of the ghost's legacy. I know, she replied softly. It's about making sure that their story doesn't fade away. We need to get this into schools, libraries, museums. We need to make sure future generations understand the price of freedom. Exactly, the veteran said, turning to her. We've shared our story with those who were willing to listen. But we need to reach the ones who might not know. We need to make sure that the youth, the ones who'll grow up and become the leaders of tomorrow, understand what we went through. They need to understand the sacrifices we made for them to have the freedoms they do. It was a sentiment that had been at the heart of everything they had done. The ghost story wasn't just about honoring the men who had served in that platoon. It was about ensuring that future generations never took for granted the sacrifices that had been made for their country, for their way of life. They needed to make sure the legacy of the ghosts was preserved, not as a footnote in history, but as a living, breathing reminder of what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to fight for something greater than oneself. The waitress, now fully committed to the cause, set to work. She reached out to educators, veteran organizations, and community leaders, asking for their support in bringing the story of the ghosts into schools and libraries across the nation. The veteran, meanwhile, began working with local media to help spread the word about the educational programs they were launching. Together, they began to build a network of people who were eager to learn about the ghosts and share their story. It wasn't an easy task. There were challenges along the way. Some schools were hesitant to introduce a story of war into their curriculum. Some communities were resistant to the idea of discussing the harsh realities of battle. But the waitress and the veteran were determined. They knew the importance of their mission, and they weren't about to let anything stand in their way. They spoke to anyone who would listen, shared the stories of the ghosts in the most personal ways they knew how. They invited veterans to speak at schools, to tell their stories firsthand, to give students a living, breathing connection to the history they were learning about. Slowly, things began to change. Schools started to implement the story of the ghosts into their curriculum. Libraries and museums began to feature exhibits on the platoon's history. Veteran organizations started hosting events where younger generations could meet and learn from those who had served. It wasn't just about telling the story anymore. It was about teaching the lessons, passing down the wisdom, and making sure the next generation understood the value of what had been fought for. As the months passed, the impact of their work became clearer. The waitress received letters from students, from teachers, from veterans who had been touched by the story of the ghosts. Many of them expressed how much they had learned, how much it had changed their perspective on what it meant to serve in the military. I never really understood what veterans went through, one letter said. But after reading about the ghosts, I realized that the freedoms I enjoy every day came at a cost. I'll never take them for granted again. It was exactly what they had hoped for. The legacy of the ghosts was no longer just their story. It was everyone's story. It was being passed down, generation by generation, as a living, breathing part of the nation's history. As the veteran read the letter, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swell in his chest. This was what it was all about. This was why they had fought so hard, why they had shared their story, why they had worked to make sure the ghosts were never forgotten. They had succeeded. The ghosts would live on. And as the veteran looked at the waitress, he knew their work wasn't over yet. They had done what they set out to do, but there was always more to be done. More stories to tell, more people to reach. And they would keep going. For the ghosts. For the veterans. For the future. As the years passed, the legacy of the ghosts continued to grow. What had started as a single story told by a few veterans had evolved into a nationwide movement. The book, The Ghosts of History, was now a staple in schools, libraries, and veteran organizations across the country. It was no longer just a story about the past. It was a bridge to the future, teaching young people the value of sacrifice, loyalty, and brotherhood. The veteran and the waitress, who had once been two strangers connected by a shared mission, now stood as pillars of a movement that had touched thousands of lives. Together, they had not only honored the ghosts but had ensured their legacy would live on for generations. The veteran, now older and feeling the weight of his years, often sat in the diner, reflecting on the journey they had taken. He had gone from being a man who carried the burden of his memories in silence to becoming a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The waitress, once unsure of her role, had become the heartbeat of the movement. She had found a purpose that connected her father's past to the future. She was no longer just a daughter seeking to honor her father's memory. She was a custodian of history, making sure that the sacrifices of the ghosts were never forgotten. One evening, as they sat together in the diner, the veteran looked across the table at her, his face full of gratitude. "I never imagined this would happen," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought we were just telling a story. But now it's so much more. It's a legacy." The waitress smiled, her eyes soft. "It's not just their legacy," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "It's our legacy. All of us. Everyone who has come together to share their story." They both fell silent for a moment, taking in the weight of what they had accomplished. It wasn't just about the book, or the tours, or the press coverage. It was about the impact they had made, the way they had brought people together, and how they had inspired so many to understand the true meaning of sacrifice. The diner, once a small and quiet place, had become a symbol of something much larger. It had become a place where stories were shared, where memories were honored, and where the sacrifices of soldiers, past and present, were respected. The veteran looked around the room, the familiar faces of the regulars still there, but now, with a new understanding. They weren't just strangers coming in for a meal. They were part of a community that had been touched by the ghost story. They were the ones who would carry that story forward, telling their children and their grandchildren about the sacrifices made by the men who fought in wars long past. "We've done something good here," the veteran said, a sense of peace settling over him. "But there's still more to be done. We can't stop now." The waitress nodded in agreement. "No, we can't. We have to keep telling their story. We have to keep making sure that their legacy lives on, for as long as it takes." The veteran smiled, a quiet pride in his eyes. "We've given them a voice," he said. "And now, it's up to everyone to listen." The two of them sat in companionable silence, the weight of the years spent telling their story finally beginning to ease. The ghost's legacy was secure. It had been honored in the way it deserved, and now it would live on, passed down through the generations. Their story was no longer just about the past. It was about the future. It was about ensuring that every sacrifice, every life lost, and every hero forgotten would never be erased again. And as the veteran and the waitress shared one final look, they knew that their work was done. But the story of the ghosts would never truly end. It would live on, in every classroom, in every veteran's heart, in every person who understood the true cost of freedom. And for that, they could both rest easy knowing that the ghosts would never be forgotten again. This emotional story follows the incredible journey of a group of soldiers known as the Ghosts, whose bravery and sacrifice had been forgotten by time until one veteran and his daughter's efforts brought their legacy back into the spotlight. An emotional story of lost comrades, battles fought, and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood. It captures the essence of what it means to serve in silence and sacrifice for something greater than oneself. As their story unfolds, the emotional story explores the life-changing impact their memories have on the next generation, inspiring a nationwide movement to ensure that the sacrifices of the ghosts are never forgotten. This emotional story shows how the truth behind the forgotten heroes is revealed, touching hearts across the country, teaching the value of loyalty, courage, and freedom. In the end, the emotional story of the ghosts is not just about remembering the past, but about making sure their legacy continues to inspire and educate future generations. Every chapter of this emotional story proves the importance of remembering those who served, making sure their sacrifices are always honored and appreciated.